Hello there and welcome today. So happy that you're joining me on the broadcast. I'm beginning a brand new series of messages today for about the next 7 weeks, and I'm very excited about this and so glad that you're here for the kickoff. Let me begin with a little Bible trivia for you, okay? What is the greatest sermon ever to be preached, and who is the greatest preacher to ever preach? The answers are both found in Matthew chapter 5. If you have your Bible, turn there with me because we're going to be looking at several verses as we go along today. And by the way, the answers to those questions are the greatest sermon that was ever preached is the Sermon on the Mount. And the greatest preacher to ever preach, of course, that would be Jesus himself, the one who preached the Sermon on the Mount. Now, for these next several weeks, we'll be working through the first 12 verses of this chapter, which basically form the introduction to Jesus' sermon. We know the passage as the Beatitudes. You're familiar with that, right? Listen to these first few verses. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up onto a mountain and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, the thing to notice here is that Jesus uses this word blessed, or maybe sometimes pronounced blessed, some 9 times in these first 12 verses. And it's an interesting word. It's the Greek word makarios, which means happy, but it goes a step further. Not just happy, but satisfyingly happy. So when you read, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," or "Blessed in the meek," for instance, you can rightly insert, "Satisfyingly happy are the poor in spirit." "Satisfyingly happy are the meek," and etc. Which brings up a great question today as we begin. Are you blessed? And by that I mean happy. I'm talking about genuinely, sure enough, without a doubt, satisfyingly happy. And for those of you who can't really answer the question in the affirmative all the time, I think I can give you one of the primary reasons why. The problem is the way we go about searching for happiness. You've no doubt heard the phrase, "looking for love in all the wrong places." The same holds true with happiness. It's like the funny story I heard about a centenarian, a 100-year-old man, and he was hard of hearing. And he was in a nightclub, if you can believe that, one night, and he was just partying away. He had a young, very beautiful woman with him, and he was dancing and drinking and just partying. All of a sudden, his doctor, who happened to be in that same nightclub, came up to him when there was a stop in the music, and he called him by name and asked him, "What are you doing? It's late, you're out here dancing, you're drinking, what's going on with you?" And the old man responded, "Well, doctor, I'm just following your advice." "My advice?" the doctor said. What do you mean by that?" And the man said, "Well, you told me I was in good health. I should go out and get a hot mama and be cheerful." And the doctor shook his head and said, No, I said you have a heart murmur, be careful." I know, corny a little bit, but funny. Seriously, what does it mean to be blessed and satisfyingly happy? Well, let's jump in here and find out by taking a look at this first beatitude of Jesus, where he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, first of all, what does that mean, to be poor in spirit? Well, I can think of a couple of things immediately. First of all, poor in spirit it's about sincerity. In other words, openness and honesty, transparency about who I am and about where I am in life. That's a person who's poor in spirit. It's about admitting that I will always have broken areas that require fixing, and admitting that God is the fixer, not me. And wow, do we live in a world filled with brokenness, with some things that need fixing. Would you agree? Let's see, there's COVID, there's a border crisis, an ever-widening racial divide, there's animus with North Korea and Russia and China and the Middle East, there's continued mass killings, ongoing riots, and civil unrest. I would say that our world definitely has broken places that only God can fix. But listen, so do we, or most of us at least. For instance, how many of you have stuff in you that you don't really like? I'm not talking about what God doesn't like necessarily or what your spouse doesn't like. I'm talking about the stuff you don't even like about you. Things you would like to change or do differently, right? Things that you would like to stop or maybe start. Oh, I wish I could be more loving. I wish I could be more unselfish. I wish I didn't lose my temper so much. I wish I didn't have that compulsion or that fear. I wish I were not so insecure. Hey, here's some good news for you. With God, all things are possible. Even all those I wishes in your life. So sincerity says, God, I've not arrived. I still have a ways to go. I still have areas that need reshaping and retooling and restructuring. I still have areas that can only be fixed by you. And listen, being sincere is not just about an area that's broken and you want God to fix. It also has to do with an area of need that requires God's intervention or God's miracle. Like when Peter, you remember when he stepped out of the boat onto the water, he was out there with the rest of the disciples going over to the other side to meet Jesus. And he stepped out of the boat onto the water to walk on the water with Jesus. He saw Jesus walking on the water coming toward him, and he said, "Hey, Lord, if that's you, let me get on the water with you." And Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out, but immediately as he began to walk on the water, a storm came. And the Bible says he began to sink. If you're familiar with the story, do you remember what he did? He cried out, "Lord, save me." Peter's faith wavered. It was broken and needed fixing. But at that moment, he also needed a miracle, didn't he? So in sincerity of heart, he cried out for his miracle, and Jesus gave it to him, and Jesus saved it. Or how about when Mary and Martha were so overcome with grief from the death of their brother Lazarus? What did they do when Jesus came walking up to them in their village? They cried out, "Jesus, if you had only been here, you were our only hope." In other words, they were declaring that their broken place could have only been fixed by a miracle from Jesus. And of course, we know that he gave them that miracle. Peter, Mary, and Martha, they were all poor in spirit, because being poor in spirit is about honesty and sincerity. Another thing, though, it's also about humility. Did you know that the root cause of all of our problems comes back to basically one thing? Every problem in your life has the same root cause. Playing God. Relying more on me than the God in me. And it's a temptation that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, when Adam was tempted to eat the fruit. God said, "Here's the deal. This whole beautiful garden, this whole place belongs to you. Have a blast. Live it up. There's only one condition. Don't eat from that tree over there." But you remember the serpent, the tempter, comes along and seduces Adam. Does anyone remember how he did that? He said to Adam, "If you eat this, you will be smart. If you eat this fruit, you'll be handsome. If you eat this fruit, you'll be rich." No. He said, if you eat this fruit, you will become, the fruit on that tree God said not to eat. If you eat that, you will become like God. In other words, you will be a God too. Now watch this. Satan never tempts us to be like him. He never says, if you'll eat this fruit, you'll be like me. No way. Because no one wants to be like the devil, do they? So he says, eat this, you'll be a God like he is a God. How many of you know, though, the devil is a liar, and we are not God? And proof positive of that is that every single one of us has at least one unsolved problem. How many of you know God never has a problem that goes unsolved, does He? So here's the bad news, good news. James says God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. The bad news is if we want to pridefully play God, He will resist us. But the good news is if we want to be genuinely happy by being poor in spirit, it can take place through our humility. And get this too, humility comes by God's grace, James says, not by willpower. Willpower can work in some situations for the short term, but it rarely lasts, right? For instance, how many diets have you started? How many exercise programs have you started? Well, there you go. All right, that's sort of a mini definition of poor in spirit. I'm rushing through it, but it kind of gets us on track. Let's move on by looking at some benefits of being poor in spirit. All right? And a couple of them I'll give. There are several, but let me give you a couple of them. The first benefit is this. When you're poor in spirit, receiving from others when you have a need gets easier. I didn't say it was easy, but it gets easier. Now, there are two basic ways to approach a not-so-easy life. The poor in spirit route, which is one of humility, transparency, sincerity with myself and God and of course, others. Or we can take the other route to push everything and everyone aside and take the proverbial bull by the horns and control things. Have you ever heard the phrase control freak? I'm sure you have. Do you know a control freak? Are they in the same room with you right now? Are they sitting close to you right now? Don't look. And to be sure, we all have instances where we control for whatever reason. It's just that some have turned it into a way of life. Now, by the way, to be fair, sometimes controlling can be a self-defense mechanism. One might use for pain avoidance due to severe abuse or hurt or tragedy and the like. But on the other hand, there are those you might call everyday type of controllers. Those who think their life has to fit into this nice, neat, perfectly wrapped box. They have an obsession with looking good for others, with acting in such a way that others will think more highly of them. But on the other hand, those who are honest and humble and poor in spirit, they live remarkably different. They have the freedom to live without faking it, without pretending to know it all and have it all together. You see, I'm convinced the average person today lives being more concerned with what others think of them than what God thinks of them. It's the old keep up the front, keep a stiff upper lip, right? Don't break down, don't be weak, don't let anyone know that you have a need. Or the familiar advertising slogans in recent years, hang in there, baby. Never let them see you sweat, right? Consequently, a person like that never opens up. They never let anyone in, trying to make sense of life and living basically all alone. But listen, the better way is to let God have all those fears and insecurities and allow Him to create sincerity and humility in you. And He will. Because people who are poor in spirit like that learn the value of sharing life with other people. Like Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, 2 are better than 1, talking about people. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their work. If one falls down, his friend can help him up. But pity the man who falls and has no one to help him up. Listen, God has wired us up in such a way that we need each other. 58 times in the New Testament, God uses the phrase one another. Love one another. Care for one another. Help one another. Encourage one another. Pray for one another. Support one another, and etc. Hey, it's in our spiritual DNA to help each other out and to receive help from others. That's one reason we have churches, because we were never meant to face our problems alone. We need each other. We have this longing for belonging. We're not just believers, we are also belongers. And I can tell you that if you don't have anyone in your life that you can be totally and brutally honest with, you are not nearly as healthy as you could be. Job 6 says a despairing man, in other words, it would be like someone who's given up on a career or life, a relationship, whatever. A despairing person should have the devotion of his friends, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. Now, isn't that a great verse? Think that through. Even when someone goes through a tragedy and says, I'm so mad, I've had it, I can't even, life just sucks, God, there is no God. Even that person, God says, deserve friends who will pull alongside him or her and say, hey, we believe in you. Don't worry about it. We'll believe in God for you. We're going to carry you through on our faith until your faith comes back. We are here for you. Listen, someone who is sincere and humble, someone who's poor in spirit, will be that kind of friend and will be willing to receive that kind of help from their friends when they need it, which makes doing life much easier. So one benefit of being poor in spirit is receiving from others gets easier. A second benefit is that relying on God gets easier. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul says, I think you ought to know, dear brothers, about the hard time we went through in Asia. We were really crushed and overwhelmed and feared we would never live through it. We felt we were doomed to die and saw how powerless we were to help ourselves. But that was good, for then we put everything into the hands of God, who alone could save us, for He can even raise the dead. And He did help us and saved us from a terrible death. Yes, and we expect Him to do it again and again. Now, a couple of things here. Paul is ready to just die, to give it all up. He said, I was crushed and overwhelmed. I was afraid. Literally, I was depressed and discouraged so much so that I was ready to check out. Have you been there before? And that's pretty amazing talk for such a man of God, isn't it? But life can do that to you. It can take you right to the brink. But, however, he said, we saw how powerless we were. Listen, Paul was poor in spirit. He was humble and sincere and honest. He said, we saw how powerless we were, but that was a good thing. Why? Because it caused him to put everything in the hands of God, who he said alone could save us. Now listen, when you're poor in spirit, you are more easily able to abide and rest in who God is and what God can do. Which, by the way, is actually a huge key to becoming poor in spirit. How do you live sincerely and honestly and humbly and in meaningful relationship with others? It comes from simply abiding and trusting and just resting, or learning to rest in Him. Learning to place your life in Him and allow Him to live through you. A number of years ago, on one of our mission trips over to Brazil, we experienced an amazingly unusual birth of a baby. We were 24 hours by boat down a tributary of the Amazon River when a smaller boat came up and docked next to us with a pregnant woman who was in obvious physical distress. Now, we put a board plank between our riverboat over to their little boat so that our two doctors on board could go over. They took their limited supplies and walked across that plank to help this mother who was in distress. As soon as they got there, no sooner than they got there, they yelled back to us on the boat, "The baby's turned wrong. Pray right now." And so everyone on our boat began to pray. And as we prayed, right in the middle of our prayer, wouldn't you know, that baby began to move until it was perfectly positioned to be born. Well, in fact, the baby was born a short time later. But much to our sorrow, when the baby was born, when it came out, it wasn't breathing. There was no semblance of life whatsoever. So again, one of the doctors turned to us on our boat and yelled, "Pray, pray." Well, this time we formed a human chain across that plank. People walked across the plank and until they got over to the other boat, and they laid hands on the doctors, and each one of us laid hands on each other all the way back into our boat, while one doctor held the baby and the other began mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And we watched and we prayed. And one of those doctors got on that baby's mouth and went and blew breath into that baby. And then again, and blew breath and life into that baby a third time and a fourth time. And all of a sudden, the doctor said, "I've got a pulse." The other doctor said, "I've got a pulse." And then those little lungs filled up and just began breathing on their own. And then the greatest sound, as that precious little one cried out. And of course, the baby was alive and, as far as we know, lived. And the next day, when that little family sailed off back to their village, man, we had a party with Jesus. I mean, we had seen a miracle. Now listen, that episode taught us a number of things, but this one in particular. And that is, if we ever intend to operate in miracle power, in our family and our relationships, miracle power in our personal life, if we ever intend to live this overcoming life, or a life of victory that God tells us about, a life of being satisfyingly happy and blessed, it will take place as we become poor in spirit, as that baby was poor in spirit. Where all we are and all we ever hope to be is placed willingly and consciously in the hands of God. So that all we are and ever hope to be is what God gives and breathes into our life. Listen, here's grace. Here's poor in spirit. It's believing and praying this way. God, I'm just choosing to believe that what you say about yourself and what you say about me, that I am your child, your kid, I belong to you and you belong to me. God, teach me to so rest and abide in you that I can trust you to daily breathe your life in me and, listen, through me to the others around me. That's poor in spirit. And that, my friend, if you're a follower of Jesus, His Spirit lives in you, He can accomplish that. And He will accomplish that as you trust and rest in Him. Well, that's it for today. We're going to continue this series. Just if you want to study ahead, go to verse 4. We'll do that one next week until we complete all of these Beatitudes. Again, I'm grateful that you've joined me today. If I can help you with anything, answer any question you have, or pray for you, contact me on any of your social media venues or email me at our website, newdaychurchbrandon.org. Have a blessed week, a satisfyingly happy week. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.